Super. So, well, I think it's good afternoon now here in the UK. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Women Automotive Winter Summit for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm going to share with you today in quite a conversational style. There's not many slides. It's more just about me talking. I think I'm better in that space, to be fair. I want to share with you some of our transformational change journey and call out the importance of cultural diversity in terms of playing a role in creating that success and delivering how diversity helps deliver change generally. In the spirit of openness, I do want to acknowledge that there are probably a lot of people on this call who may be people professionals like I am, or leaders and managers with a lot of experience and a lot of different experiences of managing change or leading change. So I'm not assuming that this is all news to you. So it's not a lesson in how to manage change, I can assure you. So first off, I really do just want to share some thoughts and observations. It's partly personal, partly mine experience. Got a couple of quotes that I hope might illustrate what I'm talking to. Thank you for the privilege. And on the topic of privilege, you can see here on my slide here, privilege isn't about what you've gone through. It's about what you haven't had to go through. I'll talk to that in a second. So it's certainly a privilege to be amongst a panel of speakers, great speakers that are lined up today, and also who have such diverse experience and backgrounds. And I'm really looking forward to listening to some of the other speakers as well. So whilst my presentation is going to talk to the topic of cultural diversity, you'll probably notice I'm not necessarily culturally diverse, unless you count some of my Scottish heritage. I don't think that is quite what we're talking to here, although no disrespect to my Scottish heritage. I'm very passionate about all aspects of diversity and inclusion. And I do just want to acknowledge that there are far more people who perhaps are better qualified than me to talk to cultural diversity due to their experiences, their backgrounds, their ethnicity, their cultural diversity. But I felt that this was an opportunity to give a platform to some of my thoughts around it. So I've chosen to talk about the topic, completely recognising my own privilege, and share some of the journey that we've been on. Cultural diversity is not always, or historically hasn't always been talked about as in the same way as gender diversity. In our organisation here at Volkswagen Group, we talked a lot, we still do talk a lot about gender diversity. But our journey on cultural diversity started about 4 or 5 years ago. And has really only taken traction in the last couple of years. And of course, we can't forget that there's intersectionality between the different representative characteristics as well. So a Black woman may well also have a disability and may be part of the LGBTQ plus community. So you can see how that intersectionality can weave through. So none of our diverse representative characteristics necessarily stand alone. So some stats to start with, always good to think about some stats. The last census in 21 in the UK, the last census in the UK identified cultural diversity, which was referenced as ethnicity, at a level of 14%, just 14% across the population. Well, we know that now has to be significantly more. And the forecasts from those who know are suggesting that it's probably at least 20% now or more. So we wait the outcome of the next census, but we do recognise already that in urban populations, we have a higher density of diversity. For instance, the population in Birmingham in the UK is at 33%, and in London, it's 40% when we're looking at ethnic diversity. And in Milton Keynes, which is where Volkswagen Group UK offices are based, it is 20%. We already know that. When compared to 14% as it was in the last census. So as a barometer check, we've checked in, of course, on our own cultural diversity. And I'll come to this stat in a little bit later on. But our representation in terms of cultural diversity in our employer demographic at the moment is 8%, which is actually an improvement on where it was. Another quote I think strikes at the heart of privilege is, when accustomed to privilege, equality feels like an oppression. I think that was shared with me by one of my colleagues a couple of weeks ago. There's no clear owner to that quote, but I found it fascinating. I found it really interesting because we get both sides of the story. And sometimes it's often implied that if someone is identified or categorized as being privileged, they can feel quite defensive and upset because they may have worked very hard for what they've accomplished. They may have overcome many obstacles to accomplish it. And the word privilege can make a person feel as though their work is being diminished. But we need to see through that, being a privileged white female myself. The key point about privilege is that it doesn't mean that a person was raised by wealthy parents, has everything handed to them on the plate, didn't have much to do other than just to show up. You know, logically, we know that that isn't the case. But privilege does mean that some of us have advantages over others for any number of reasons that we don't control. And it's kind of infinite in a way. But it's things like who we are, where we come from, the colour of our skin, things that have happened in our lives, the experiences that we've had. And even when things haven't come easy for some people, they can still have privileges that others don't have. And I think this was a really important reflection that we took as an organisation and we learned to talk to, because actually the majority of our organisation is white male. Our gender diversity is 45% in total of our current population, but that drops dramatically as you get into more senior roles. So we were coming from a not untypical statistical representation, particularly across the automotive industry. Although I have to say, with many new startups and new and different disruptors, as they were called, no longer disruptors, in the automotive industry, I think the diversity levels there are significantly different, which is fantastic to see. So in order to embrace our cultural differences, we need to recognise the privileges that different groups have, and we need to come with and ensure that the workplace is equitable and inclusive. And as people director here, sorry, we have automatic lights here. I'll just turn my light back on. Apologies for that. I was hoping that wouldn't happen. So we need to ensure that our workplace is equitable and inclusive. And I know lots of organisations talk to this topic at the moment. But I just thought the world's changed. The world's changed pre, but now during and now post-pandemic. And there have been many societal impacts that have changed our view on what diversity and inclusion means, certainly accelerated people's learning, but it's also lifted the lid on certain topics that perhaps were not so openly discussed previously. And some of those impacts, social impacts, were the real catalysts for change. This is my view, but I think others might share it. So in 2020, there was the horrific story about the murder of George Floyd in the States. With that, Black Lives Matter as a group ignited, although they were first initiated following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of African-American teen Trayvon Martin. And we also had, from a female perspective, some very tragic and horrific stories about the murder of Sarah Everard and the two sisters that were murdered in North London Park, Nicole Smallman and Beba Henry. So why do I share those thoughts with you? Well, first of all, they had all those stories had a really big impact on me personally. But there was a journey to get there. I have to say, I probably was particularly with the murder of George Floyd. I wasn't as connected to that being female as I was to the Sarah Everard and Nicole Smallman and Beba Henry murders. Being female, I identified with that more, but I did feel her real sadness and a real emotion around the George Floyd murder. But there was a difference in terms of my engagement. The murder of George Floyd really propelled us into action as an organisation. And this is what happened. We were slow to act. And by that, I mean, we hadn't really acknowledged social or political topics previously. Volkswagen Group tends to be very understated, historically has been very understated, much less so now. There'd always been a reticence to speak up or acknowledge those sort of external events that were happening. Of course, the world's moved on. We can't separate organisation and external events in any way these days. And we received some feedback loudly and clearly from some of our ethnically diverse population that this approach of silence just wasn't acceptable. I had a close team member who also raised my awareness. She was representing some of the views of that group, being Asian herself, and she made me aware of the depth of the feeling and emotion and sadness and anger coming from this group. And I would suggest that probably there was that depth of anger and feeling across the organisation more generally, but we just weren't talking to it. So we responded in a way that we hadn't responded previously. I made my MD aware. He wrote a very heartfelt blog to all colleagues about the George Floyd murder and what that meant to him, but also recognising what it means to our colleagues, particularly in that community, but also on a wider perspective. And it was the catalyst for the formation of our Cultural Diversity Employee Network Group. Suddenly, they were empowered and they had a voice. They'd seen how they could proactively push for change in a way that they hadn't seen before. And as a senior leader, that plaster had been pulled off around that silence and around the vulnerability that we used to feel when talking about these type of topics. And the lines are often blurred between politics and what we feel comfortable talking about. There's a fear of getting it wrong. We can feel uncomfortable. Language that we use is important, and we often think, what's the words that I choose? How will it land? Might it cause offence? Might it be wrong? And I'm told by my colleague in my team, who's our D&I business partner, who's Asian herself, that ethnically diverse people can also feel very uncomfortable about speaking up for fear of getting it wrong, possibly for very different reasons than white people. And that fear of cultural bias or discrimination sits with many of us. So this was the context and the background to some of the changes that we've made around our cultural diversity and inclusion. So what's it meant for us? What's it meant for our business? You know, at the end of the day, we're all working for, I'm working for a global organisation. What difference does recognising diversity in all its guises, but what does it make to our organisation? Well, transformation, strategic transformation, requires cultural transformation for it to be a success. We're brilliant at having strategic goals. We have a new sales auto strategy 2030, and we'll always achieve, our targeted goals, etc. What we've talked about much less in the past, and cultural diversity is part of this, is our culture, overarching our culture. What does it mean for us? Because without culture, with strategy, transformation either may not happen, or if it does happen, doesn't happen as well as it can do, with the engagement of people, understanding what their purpose is here in the organisation, understanding why things are important, but equally understanding what values we have and what we're all working to. One cannot really succeed without the other. And as part of our transformation, our strategic transformation here, we've really dialed up the focus on culture in a way that we never have done before. And just a very quick quote from Peter Drucker: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." I'm sure some of you have already heard that saying previously. So, the customer is at the centre of everything we do. Just to really call this out on this slide, McKinsey and the other consultancies that we all know and love have talked to this very much, but of course I do sometimes look at what they are writing and appreciate the thinking that it stimulates. So consumers are expecting more from brands than ever before, and the cost is high for retailers that don't take action on racial equity, diversity and inclusion. All in, inclusion and diversity drive shopper habits. Authentically inclusive marketing is really a key point of focus. Deloitte talked to that. And why inclusion and diversity should be top of mind for every marketeer. Well, for all organisations, these comments are relevant. So the customer for us at Volkswagen is at the centre of everything we do. In the past, I would say it hasn't been well enough, but in our new strategy where we're moving to online sales, not only retail sales, we know that this has to be at the centre of everything that we do. Our brands and our processes and our customer propositions, so we have 6 brands here in the UK under one Volkswagen Group UK umbrella, All their products need to reflect customer buying habits, trends, and our global position in the market. And this should include a wide outreach to reflect the diversity of our society, and that includes cultural diversity. In a survey conducted by the Journal of Consumer Affairs, about 1/3 of minority consumers, this was a survey conducted in the States, 1/3 of minority consumers responded that they have experienced racial discrimination from an advertisement. And that percentage spikes when looking at what happens physically inside retailers' doors. More than 60% of African Americans say they have experienced racial discrimination inside a retail store, and half experienced racial discrimination when making a purchase. Now, I know that in my world, that's not my world. That's not something that I experience. And this is something that has been really brought to light by our cultural diversity ENG. We need to step into people's shoes to really understand what their experiences are. Again, my colleague who was here several years ago opened my eyes to this, and reverse mentoring with another colleague has also, who comes from an ethnically diverse Asian background, has also opened my eyes to what it's like, for instance, the different experiences to walking through an airport, whereas an ethnically diverse person may get stopped by security every single time and a white person doesn't. So that just really brought it to life for me about the experiences in the retail environment as well. So is our cultural diversity in the UK population reflected in the view of our customer? Well, it does change, and it's going to continue to change. So as with many organisations, our marketing, our advertising now is far more representative of diversity in all areas, actually. But for instance, we promote a lot of finance and leasing agreements as part of our sales. Some cultures prioritise earning and holding this. And again, this is was shared with me by someone from an Asian diverse background, holding it and exchanging it for a direct purchase rather than taking out leasing. Do we consider that in our sales propositions? I'm not going to get into that debate. I don't know. But how have we considered their buying patterns? So, for instance, in the finance industry, certain mortgages are made available for people applying for mortgages from different cultural backgrounds that have a different view about taking out a degree of debt as it would be seen over a number of years. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to thinking about our customer and certainly our culturally diverse customer base, and a lot to challenge ourselves around as well. So we certainly don't have all of those answers. And of course, that's reflected in in how we attract people into our organisation as well. The final piece of, I guess, learning that we've had this year is around our cultural transformation and the organisation change that we have implemented in order to put our new operating model. So direct sales, it's required a huge amount of systems landscape changes that we've not yet fully delivered. They will come through next year. But this year, what we did do, we implemented a really large, wide-reaching organisation change. So the structure of our organisation change. And it's a really sensitive topic and requires a high degree of input from managers, people teams, and the people themselves. But there is a positive of change, because as I say here on this slide, with change comes opportunity for growth. Our change programme created 125 vacancies. Now, that wasn't a reflection of people exiting our organisation, I must say. We'd held vacancies so that we could manage job security. But we had new skills with vacancies, new skills and capability requirements. And we recognised this at a senior level, almost like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to challenge ourselves with that number of vacancies to both promote and attract externally from the market and hire the best and most diverse talent possible. And we're still on that journey, so we're measuring ourselves against that. One of the things that it's made us understand better is how we attract people externally. So we're moving to a position of looking for skills and potential rather than experience. And this will continue to open up our talent pool more widely and will support our ambition to increase our cultural diversity as well. And as this chart shows, we are making progress. The jumps are not big, but in our world, they're big, considering the length of time that we've been challenging ourselves to make improvements. Sometimes change takes time, and our impatience to get to that point has helped drive that, but we've also had to accept that it doesn't happen overnight and it needs continued focus. So we've made a leap from 5% to 8% in terms of our cultural diversity representation as it was in 2020. It's progress, but there's more to do to ensure that we meet anywhere near our local community representation of 20%, as I referenced earlier. One other good piece of data that comes through from the opportunity that we have with our vacancy gaps is our hiring trends indicate that 58% of our external offers have been female. That's a real turnaround. However, again, we have more to do. What we also see from our data is that we continue to have a low conversion rate for Black and Black African applicants, from application to shortlisting to interview, and we struggle to understand why that is. We're still doing the work to really understand why that is. And there are lots of assumptions we can make, and there's lots of actions, as you might imagine, that we're putting in place. One of the most important steps that I feel that we've taken is quite recently, and this has come about through discussion within my team and with some of the cultural network groups, was that we need to level our playing field. So one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that in attraction and then when through to interview, we have a more level playing field, particularly if people have come from different backgrounds and maybe haven't had some of the opportunities to have the experiences that other candidates would have. So for instance, if we're drawing from outside automotive, then we want to give those candidates a level playing field in applying, so that if they're competing against automotive candidates, they've at least had the same interview questions and competencies to prepare against ahead of the selection process. So we will be doing that in 2023 to see if that starts to make a difference for us, and really starting to open it up, our diversity up from a socio-economic perspective as well. So this is a real change in mindset for us, and culture, of course, is all about change of mindset. We want to require to hire more on the basis of skills and potential, and not so much on the experience, and see whether that makes a difference for us. We, of course, now have a really big emphasis on IT, digital and e-commerce marketing roles in a way that we didn't before. And automotive experience is much less of a requirement there. In fact, we're proactively looking for candidates to join us with no automotive experience. And this comes back to the different and diverse ways of thinking that are so important for us to bring into our organisation. We need to move away from having been fairly insular, as much of the automotive industry has been historically, to being much more bringing the outside in. Then there are just two other points I'd like to cover before I finish, and I can see there's questions, but I haven't dared look at them yet because I'm going to get distracted from what I'm talking to. So I'm sure Misha will guide me in a moment. Inclusive leadership is a really key enabler of change. So we've raised awareness amongst our leadership teams and asked them to challenge their own thinking, their own potential bias. Not only we're challenging about bias, and even, dare I say, in some instances, discrimination. Because as I say to my colleagues sometimes, whether we like it or not, whether it's intended or not, discrimination exists. And at a recent leadership conference, this session was voted by our leaders as the most impactful. So positively, we know we have an extremely receptive audience who want to listen, learn and exchange ideas. And we know that the best leaders assemble teams that exhibit diversity in all opinions, life experiences and professional skills. And inclusive leadership is also statistically proven to enhance performance. And of course, Harvard Business Journal reports that. Of course they would. So teams with inclusive leaders are 17% more likely to say they are high performing. They're also 20% more likely to say they make high quality decisions and 29% more likely to report collaborative behaviour. And other studies have shown a connection between diversity and innovation as well, of course, with many of the tech companies. Most obviously, Apple will have talked to this, with attracting people in that think very differently and, again, very diverse backgrounds. And my final point is really just around data and the importance of data. So we've made a conscious effort in our organisation to obtain the data and report on it. And we don't always have, particularly in the people team, the best systems to do that. But we know that what gets measured gets attention and supports a drive for improvement. And all of this is about improvement. And for us, it was a huge step change. So we are the same as many organisations who recognise the importance of cultural change, and diversity, see the need for change, and we're working with our employees to support us in achieving that goal. So their involvement, their support, their opportunity to influence how we do it is so important. It also provides us a narrative externally, really importantly, to be able to share about how our employees have this shared vision around how we want to improve our cultural diversity and more generally our diversity. So it's a long game and change doesn't happen overnight, but we are determined to make a difference. So on that, I'm going to finish and say thank you for listening. I would now just hand over to Misha. I have no idea what my timing was, so I do apologise if I've gone a little over time.
Don't worry. Thank you, Penny. This was so interesting. I'm sure nobody minds. We are a little over, but I absolutely want to ask at least some of the questions we're having here. I think some might have been answered as you went along, but Sarah asked, for instance, what the numbers are for gender diversity in the technical roles in engineering.
Right, great. So we don't cover engineering here. We don't manufacture in the UK. So okay. I apologise, I can't reference those stats for our engineering plants. Although I would say that it's growing, but I don't have the stats. But what I can say to you in tech terms here in our IT team, in the leadership team, I'm very proud to say now that we have 6 senior leaders in that team, 4 of whom are female, 2 of whom are culturally diverse. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight. And that change has happened literally in the last 18 months.
Wow, that's impressive. And I think that also ties in with a question Anna has. What measures specifically have had the largest impact on increasing diversity? How did you reach that, for instance, this change over the last 18 months?
I think that it is a forensic attention to our succession planning, our talent identification internally, and our external. So our external hiring. And that really comes from my talent acquisition team and the engagement of managers and leaders in those processes. We're by no means perfect, but raising the awareness and educating people of the importance starts to help them thinking differently. So to answer your question, Anna, I think that probably is the one thing that's really made the difference, but it has to be forensic. It needs to be challenging. And we have had things in place, for instance, like we've done things like gender balanced interview panels. We have had other initiatives around selecting and getting gender balanced and, if we can, culturally diverse shortlists. But we also have a challenge around data and how much we can really disclose of that when obviously we've got GDPR considerations. That's how I would say that is that.
Thank you. We have tons of follow-up questions on that. I think I would say let's do one more, and people please feel free to reach out to Penny, network with her. But the follow-up questions mostly concern how your process is really structured to, for instance, ensure that those candidates get into interviews. Like Anna wants to know if you're using computer-based pre-filtering of CVs. And Claire wants to know if you are going directly, for instance, into universities. And Maya adds, how about soft skills? So we can't cover it all in a minute or two, I get that, but maybe you could touch upon that.
Sure. So on the computer, I would love to be able to do computer screened out interviews. We don't have the system to do that, but that would be aspirational for sure. Yes, we do. We do target universities, and we want to take a different approach this year. Again, always challenging ourselves to do things differently. We do want to. We already have a group of our graduates and undergraduates that engage directly with universities. So one of the challenges we're going to ask them to do this year is to look more from broaden it out from a socioeconomic and culturally diverse perspective as well. And there was a third one there, Misha. I forgot the third question. Sorry.
The third one was about soft skills.
Oh, right. Yeah. So yes, we do look for those through the hiring process, and the value that we place on soft skills is considerable. We measure those in performance against soft skills. I'll be really honest though, I sometimes think, again, you know, we come from typically a certain level of male senior leadership. You know, I think that's been changing over the last years, and the soft skills have been better recognized, typically in the past less so.
I actually just learned we are renaming them human skills, which I like a lot better.
Yeah, like that too.
All right. I am so sorry that we don't have more time to take questions, but they will not get lost, everybody. I promise you that we could spend hours talking about this. But Penny, we'll have to go. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your thoughts. And we will disappear now, the two of us, and I will be back with our next speakers in a moment.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you, everyone.